Hi, I'm Mary Matz, creator of TwistedYarns.com. Today, I'm going to demonstrate how to knit a double-sided facing with horizontal buttonholes. Prior to starting this buttonhole band, you need to make some calculations. In our sample, on a bulky machine, we want a 2-inch wide band to accommodate 1-inch buttons. Based on my gauge, this means my buttonholes should be 3 stitches across and the facing should be about 7 stitches across. In addition, you need to add 7 more stitches for the back facing because they fold under. You need 1 stitch for your seaming stitch, 1 stitch for your turning stitch, and 1 stitch for your attachment stitch. Let's see how this lays out. I pulled out 17, which is the amount of 7 plus 3. Starting at the left-hand side, this first needle represents the seaming stitch. The next 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, represent the facing. The next one represents the turning stitch. Then 7, and the last one represents the attachment stitch. In addition, we know that we have 3 stitches that we need on each of these sides for the buttonhole. So if I move these back here, then you can see what we have across, how we have our 17 stitches divided. You're going to take your China marker or your marker, and you're going to do some markings on your bed, and you want to do this prior to starting. These little carrots are marking my buttonhole. Here's my other buttonhole that's being marked. Even though it's 3 stitches, you count the base of the needles, not the humps or the points. Then you also want to mark your turning stitch and your attachment stitch. And I usually mark those with just straight lines. We are going to be using these throughout while we're knitting this facing, so it's important to have this marked ahead of time. Okay, all the stitches over here will represent the garment itself. This is now that we have our bed marked, it's time to cast on. I've already cast on with an E-wrap, and I'm about to do the first row. You always want to do, if you're doing an E-wrap, you always want to do 2 rows before you start doing your turning row. Now remember, we marked this one as a turning row and this one as an attachment row. And so what we want to do is bring those out into hold position. I set my carriage to hold. Now on the bulky you can't automatically return it, so we'll do it manually. And so now I'm going to knit across, and this is actually, when it reaches those 2 needles, it's actually doing a tuck. Most people think of this as a slip, but it really is a tuck because the yarn is going over the needle. If it was a slip stitch, the yarn would go under the needle. Now I'm going to return these to the D position, which will let them knit off on the next row. So as I'm moving to the left, I'm going to bring them out into hold, and as I go into the right, I'm going to move them to D position. And we're going to work in this manner until we get to where the buttonhole would be. What we're going to do is we're going to take out our 3 stitches that are marked for our buttonholes, and we are going to lay our ravel cord in it, bring it back, and knit them off manually so that there's about 1/4 of an inch, not too long, but not too long a strand, but enough that this is cleared. We're going to put a weight on it. Not much weight, but just enough. Do the same thing for this side. Manually knit them off. Okay, remember to bring out your stitches. Put the little weight on this one too. And knit a row. Now this is where you're examining it to make sure that those buttonholes actually knit off. I'm going to retract those. So I want to show you what we're going to be making. We're actually going to be crocheting and binding off this buttonhole. And as you can see, we're going to go down and do it on this one right here. Let's look at what we have on the inside. If you notice, you can see our ravel cord there. It looks like we have 2 rows of ravel cord, but in fact we only have one. We actually have the top of the ravel cord and the bottom of the ravel cord. And what we're going to do is we're going to bind off the top edges together, and then we're going to come back and do the bottom edges together. So fold your work along your ravel cord row. Take your yarn end and place it, leaving about a 5-inch yarn end, place it down the middle. Now we're going to fold over along the turning stitch, and we're going to look at our work again. Now we're going to join the top edge of both of the buttonholes together first. The top of this buttonhole on the facing is the farthest away from me. The top edge of this buttonhole on the front facing is closest to me. Notice how that top edge is impacted by the ravel cord. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches that are touched by the ravel cord. If you notice, and I put my finger in there, if you notice, these are going to be either U's or humps. And in this case, these are U's. That's important to remember because you have to find 1 stitch beyond on each edge. And so in this case, 1 stitch beyond is a U stitch, which is this one right here. Okay, vice versa, we're going to go to the other side and look at that row. And if you notice, we also have 4 stitches impacted by the ravel cord, and in this case, they're humps. So we want to go 1 stitch beyond the ravel cord and go to and find that next stitch, which is a hump. Okay, so we're going to pick up that stitch, then we're going to go over to the top edge of this ravel cord and pick up the next stitch, which is a U. 1 stitch beyond. We're going to pick up our feeder yarn and slip stitch. Then we're going to go to the first stitch of the top edge and go back to the first stitch of the top edge of the buttonhole and slip stitch. The next stitch we're going to go and do the same thing. We're going to pick that one up and go to the corresponding one back here. When they're in the middle of the buttonhole, they're easy to spot. Do it again. and a slip stitch. You don't want to make your slip stitches too loose nor too tight. That's where the practice comes in. Now we're going to the last stitch. That's affected by the ravel cord on both the one closest to me and the one farthest from me. And I'm doing another slip stitch. Then we're going to go one stitch beyond. This is where the hump is important to note. That's the hump, and on this side it's the U. So it's this one here. And we're doing another slip stitch. Now, at this point, we're going to do a very tight chain one. And we're going to turn our work to look at it. Right now, if you pull this apart, you'll see the 2 rows of ravel cord still in there. That's good. Now, we're going to flip our work to the other side of it. And now you'll see the bottom edges are still exposed. So, just like we did on the other side, we examined our humps and our U's. This one happens to be U shape on the farthest edge from me. Now these are the bottom edges of the buttonhole, and on the row closest to me, they're humps. So I'm going to find the very next stitch beyond the ravel cord. I'm going to put that on my hook, go back here, and I'm going to find the corresponding U over here. Now let's look carefully. Here we go. Right here. And we're going to do our slip stitch. Then we're going to go to the first stitch of the ravel cord, and the first stitch of the ravel impacted by the ravel cord here, and we're going to do another slip stitch. Then we're going to come back, do the next one, to the next one, and then finally the last one, and the last one. But that's not the last one that we have to do. We still have to work one beyond. So we're going to come over here. This was a hump, so we're going to pick up that hump, and over here it's the U. So we're going to pick up that U and pull that through. Now remember I said you're going to need this little yarn end later? Well, you're going to pull that through and then pull up the loop tight. Now, we're going to come over here, clip our yarn, and we're going to turn our work to examine it from the right side. Now there's 2 places you have to examine it. One is on the actual front facing, and if you notice, we didn't catch any. We're looking for a couple things. We're looking to see if we caught anything, that we caught everything correctly, so it's nice and smooth. But we're also looking to see if we accidentally caught something we shouldn't have and it closes up our buttonhole. Well, in this case, it's perfectly fine. So I examine it from the outside, then I examine it from the inside facing side, and everything looks good. Now I turn it back here, but before I proceed to do anything else, I want to knot off my ends one more time. And in this case, we're going to cross over. We're going to wrap our yarn twice in that loop and pull it tightly. That's our second knot. The first knot we already put in just to hold it in place with the chain. Then we're going to return and do one more knot with just a single crossover. Pull it tightly and clip our yarn. Since this is a bulky fabric, I'm going to clip it about 3/4 of an inch. If you're working on a standard gauge machine, you're going to probably clip at a 1/2 inch. Okay, now let's just take one more look, make sure we're satisfied with it. All right, looking good. Come back to the inside and remove our ravel cord. You want to pull the ravel cord by the loop end, because if you pulled it from this end, you'd have to make it go all the way around and it might jam up on you. So this way, just pull it from the loop end and remove the ravel cord. Now, what do we have? Our second perfect buttonhole. Isn't that nice? That's using the crochet technique. So now, for those of you who are not comfortable with a crochet hook in your hand, we're going to do the same or a similar technique using the knitting machine. Just like we did before, we're going to look at the upper loops of the stitches along the ravel cord and the ones closest to me. So first we're going to hang these stitches that are furthest away from me. Now note, the ravel cord touches 4 stitches, but the end ones are actually half stitches, but you do have to pick up those stitches too. Then you need to pick up 1 extra stitch on each end, just like before. Perfect. Note that we put our fold edge, the stitch where we're going to be turning, toward the right. Then we're going to come to the outer side of the second buttonhole of the facing. Well, actually, it's the outer part. And we are going to pick up those same loops. Now note, this is the outer extra stitch, so this first stitch goes on the second needle from the end. Let's not get that ravel cord in there. And then 1 extra stitch on this end and 1 extra stitch, let's find it, there we go, on this end. We are going to take our yarn and knit through these stitches. And it's easy to do one at a time. You can do this with your carriage if you can get your tension high enough. But we are going to do them, and since this is a bulky machine that I'm demonstrating on, we are pulling the stitch back about 1/4 of an inch. It would be less if you were working on a standard size. It'd be maybe 1/8 of an inch. Okay, once we have this done, we are going to latch off these stitches. Just by pulling 1 stitch through the other stitch. We're not adding any extra feeder, so we kind of have to make sure this one goes beyond. And when we get to the end, we're going to keep that loop on our hook. We're going to pull it up a little bit. As for this end, this yarn end, we're going to tuck it. We're going to put our finger through here and we're going to tuck it right in this little hole that's between the turning edge and the buttonhole. You'll see it in a minute while we do that, because when I turn this around, I want this yarn end to be available. And now we're going to do it and pick up the stitches furthest away from us and then put the stitches that are closest to me on the bed. Okay, so let's start with the stitches that have the ravel cord. Now in this case, there are 3 whole stitches, not half stitches on the end. So in this case, we're just going to pick up 1 extra stitch on each end. Then I'm going to return to the side closest to me, and I'm going to pick up the side closest to me. Now remember, this is an end stitch, that's an extra stitch, so this stitch goes right on the second needle from the end. On this end, we're going to pick up 1 extra stitch. Let's see, that would be this one right. Let's see. This one right here. And on this end, we're going to pick up 1 extra stitch. Now, this loop is actually part of that feeder chain that's attached to our yarn here. So I am going to pull up 1 extra stitch on this end and latch it on there, just so it doesn't get pulled out when we go to knit off these other stitches. Now, just like before, we're going to move our needles so that we can knit them off. Now note, I'm going to pull them in a little tighter here so we don't lose our stitches, our loops. Now note, I'm going to pull this and I'm going to make that stitch firm, but I'm not going to knit it off. I'm only going to knit off the 5 stitches that are my buttonhole stitches, and plus the 2 end ones. Now once again, I'm pulling it so it's about 1/4 inch through. And now I'm going to latch these off. But this time, I'm going to latch them off, including this end loop. I can cut this yarn at this point, giving myself a little extra room. And now I can latch these off, starting with the loop on the end. Oops. Very similar to the crocheting that we just did on the other one. Now, remember that end that I had pushed through? We're going to take that end and we're going to slip it through this last loop and pull it up. And pull this one up tightly. That locks down that end of it. Now, let's examine our buttonhole. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that I caught all of them, number 1, but also that I didn't catch things that would close up my buttonhole. And I'm looking at the front side here. All looks good. And I'm looking at the facing on the inside. All looks good. At this point, I return to my inside, where my ends are, and that created the first loop through, created the knot. Now we're going to do our double knot where we wrap it around twice. Pull it up snugly and then wrap it around once and knot it. And there is our bound buttonhole. Looks very much like the one that we did by crochet. Now that we've completed all of the buttons on our facing, I want you to take a look at it. Look how nice and neat that is. The turning stitch made a very nice edge, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. We also have our attachment row, which is actually knit every other row. On the back side of the attachment row, you can see where that tuck stitch lifted the extra loop up, and we'll get back to that in just a second. Then we have the seaming edge, and that is made up of bumps, little knots, and loops, bumps and loops. And so it's important to recognize those because that's how we're going to attach it. We're going to start by going under the first tuck stitch and then going over to the to the seaming edge and looking for the first loop. Then we're going to return over to the attachment row and picking up just the first loop of the two loops. Then returning over to pick up the next loop, not the knots, the loops, and so on and so forth. So the next one here, and over here, our next loop. Now we're going to snug it up a little bit, and that'll bring it down. We had 2 strands. Now we're bringing it down to just 1 strand. This is our end, so we're going to pull these through and tighten it up. Now you can see the stitches on this side, but if you turn it over, even though it's a contrasting color, you cannot see the stitches from the right side. So let's go back and do a few more. I'm going to pick up this loop on our tuck stitch, just the upper loop, coming over here and then picking up the next, just the half stitch of along the edge, that is the loop. Pick up the next one over here and the loop over here. Come over here, pick up the next one, and then the next loop on the edge stitch. Now, we can pull this up a little bit, and there you go. Now this isn't attached down, so I don't want to pull too hard. Come back to here, pick up just the top loop, coming over, roll back the edge and pick up the loop. Pick up just the top loop of this tuck stitch, come over here, pick up the loop, come back over here, pick up the tuck stitch, and the loop between the knots. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm going to put my thumb right here on it and pull through so I prevent any knots from getting formed. Okay, so I think we've done enough to show you how nice that looks from the front, and you don't even see it, and it's very, very flat. even on a bulky, it's a flat feel. Now, this is a finished edge right now on the facing, so you don't have to do anything more to it if you don't want to. But what I like to do is take my crochet hook and choose one. Since this is done on the bulky and I'm using worsted weight yarn, I'm choosing an H crochet hook. I'm going to slip it under the first stitch, 2 loops of that stitch, and I'm going to pull up a loop. I'm going to chain 1 using 1 strand. I'll use this one to weave in ends. And you can either do single crochets, and in this case we want to pull up enough so that we have enough so the tension matches the main body, because you have 2 rows for each one of these loops. So you don't want to pull it too tight. And we can do either single crochets across, makes a very nice finished edge. Can you see how that looks? Or, because it's bulky, and perhaps you'd like something a little less outstanding, so you can just do a slip stitch. But when you do the slip stitch, you've got to make sure that you don't pull it too tight. That reinforces it as another alternative. Now when you do the single crochet over here, that can be a base for adding additional things, but because this is bulky, I usually either leave it as a single crochet, or I personally love the slip stitch because it doesn't add any additional distance, but it helps smooth out any flaws you might have on the edge. And the back side is attractive too, it reinforces it. At the left side, you can actually do a chain 1, and then in the next stitch, insert your hook right in through under both those loops of that turning stitch, and you can actually work a reverse single crochet, which gives it a nice pie crust kind of edge. So let's take a look at it in just a second. When you do this, the pie crust edge, or the reverse single crochet, or the backward single crochet, actually puts a roll on it. And that might be really a super edge for a jacket. But you can see how it has that really nice curl to it. So, some options for you to do. Well, thank you for joining me.